They followed the rules, but there were no spaces to follow them into. In Ouagadougou, 12,000 cars were towed, but not a single new parking lot existed. Mothers carrying market baskets watched in disbelief as their cars were hoisted away. Fathers leaving the hospital with prescriptions in hand, elders clutching rice sacks, workers returning from 12-hour shifts, all came back to the same cruel sight, a fine slapped like shame across the windshield. 50,000 francs CFA. No signs, no warnings, no space to breathe, let alone park. This was not lawlessness. This was life punished for existing in a system with no mercy. The Burkina Faso latest news barely whispered what this truly meant. But Ibrahim Traore did not need a headline. The president of the people asked a single question that echoed through the capital. How can you penalize your people without ever preparing a place for them to stand? This is not a story about traffic. It is a story about power, about the invisible line between justice and humiliation. Subscribe to Rise Africa Rise. Stay with us. Because what happened next turned receipts into redemption and redefined leadership for an entire continent. The tow truck crawled through the streets of Ouagadougou like it bore the weight of something shameful. One by one, the wheels of the people rose, not because of theft, not because they blocked an ambulance, but because someone dared to park near a pharmacy, or beside a mango stand, or a few steps past a line that existed only in someone's clipboard. A woman screamed not in defiance but in disbelief. She had stopped for 10 minutes to buy fever medicine for her child. When she returned, her car was already in the air, suspended like an accusation. The officer avoided her gaze. He extended the fine 50,000 francs CFA. She did not argue. She simply lowered herself to the curb, clutching the medicine as if it were the last ounce of protection she could offer her child. A few meters away, an elderly man stood motionless. His son had loaned him that car for a heart checkup. Now his ride home was gone, and with it a piece of his trust in a city he had given his life to. These were not isolated mistakes. These were rituals, daily injustices, swallowed in silence. In just 6 months, over 12,000 such moments occurred. And behind every fine was the same invisible truth: no signs, no instructions, no warning, just assumptions and penalties. No parking lots, no public plan, no space to exist. But in the hush between metal clinks and muffled sobs, a name began to rise, not with banners, but in murmurs of hope. President Ibrahim Traore, the leader who walked through crowds without cameras and listened without rehearsed replies. What followed was not protest. It was more dangerous. It was doubt, a soft unraveling of the system's story, and the cruelty of it all stung deeper when seen clearly. This was not a crackdown in wealthy districts. No, these were markets, pharmacies, clinics, schools, construction zones, the heartbeat of the working nation. And it was those very people, the laborers, mother students, who were being fined for trying to live. On paper, a fine seems fair, a rule, a neutral nudge. But in the hands of a woman without power, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a brand, a bruise, a quiet sentence. You are here, but you do not belong. They called it urban order. But what kind of order begins by targeting those born into disorder? Not of their choosing. What kind of justice confiscates the only tool a father has to get to work, then blames him for walking? Some appealed. Others pleaded. Many sold fruit rice or phone credit to pay the fine. Some stopped driving altogether, choosing to walk for hours rather than risk another punishment. And those who remained learned to shrink, to park in shadows, to live a little smaller each day, not out of guilt, but out of fear, not of thieves, but of chains, not of danger, but of policy. No mayor stood up to ask the obvious. If there's nowhere to park, is it still fair to penalize the parked? No editor printed the deeper truth. When the system fails to provide, is it justice to punish those surviving its absence? But somewhere out of the spotlight, a conversation began. Not loud, not televised, but real. In a quiet room, a man leaned forward, not to speak but to listen, not to outrage but to patterns. President Ibrahim Traore did not react. He reflected. And in his heart, a question grew louder than any siren. What kind of leader finds the people before making room for their lives? If you believe justice cannot begin by humiliating the vulnerable, then let your voice rise through the silence. Comment Amen if you believe no one should be fined for surviving where the system refused to build. Because this story is not over. The wheels rose. But something heavier, something undeniable was beginning to land. There was no motorcade, no flashing cameras, no lines scripted for applause. Ibrahim Traore stepped onto the street not as a spectacle, but as a citizen. No bodyguards, no entourage, no speech. Only his eyes moved, scanning the line of tow trucks as they rolled past, steady and unfeeling like machines dragging away the memory of fairness. That morning, an elderly woman sat hunched on an overturned bucket beside her chained car. Her headscarf was faded from years of sun. In her lap, a frayed basket held a small harvest of tomatoes and groundnuts. Her voice cracked, not with anger, but with exhaustion. She murmured to no one in particular, "I have parked here for 10 years. They never gave us another place. Now they take it like it was never ours." The officer did not respond. He stared at his clipboard, pen ready, and then Traore stepped forward. No fanfare, no orders. Just one simple motion. He placed his hand gently over the clipboard and turned it face down. The officer froze. Traore turned to the woman and bowed his head, not in grand gesture, but just enough. Just enough for her to know that this time someone was listening. For the first time in years, she was not invisible. She was acknowledged. The crowd held its breath. Then came the question, quiet yet thunderous in meaning. How many parking lots have we built here? The answer was a silence that said everything. None. And in that silence, something cracked, not in the hearts of the people, but in the architecture of neglect that had stood unchallenged for too long. Traore took the clipboard, tore the ticket, and from the inside pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a pen, not just to sign, but to redraw. On the back of the torn paper, he wrote the first decree of a new order. All enforcement paused until dignity is restored. Not everyone clapped. Behind sealed doors in the chilled offices of power, a senior official muttered his disapproval. If we let emotion override the law, we lose the city. The people must respect the system, not expect the system to yield. His words never made headlines, but they echoed in corridors that had long confused control with leadership. Yet outside those halls, something had already shifted, because Traore had chosen to leave the room and stand with the people. By nightfall, tow trucks were called back. Tickets were suspended. Officers were told not to return with chains, but with questions. And none of it began with a law. None of it required a protest. It began with one man who stopped, who looked, who listened. For weeks, he continued not behind microphones, but behind the market stalls, in schoolyards, at auto repair shops, not asking what citizens demanded, but what they had never been offered. What he heard was not rage. It was the deeper ache of resignation. People no longer expected fairness. They expected silence. And that perhaps was the true cost of the policy, not the ticket, not the tow, not the fine, but the slow erosion of belief, the quiet acceptance that no one in power would ever say, "We failed you." That is why Traore did not give a speech, because speeches too often are masks. And what this moment demanded was confession. So he asked for silence. Inside the ministries, inside the police barracks, inside the council chambers. Not silence for the fallen, but silence for the living, those who built the country, but were never invited into its design. And from that silence came not fury, but something more dangerous to the old way: responsibility. Traore did not blame the officers. He did not scapegoat the departments. He simply drew a new boundary, not on streets, but in the soul of public service. Because true leadership is not measured by how many laws you enforce. It is measured by how many wounds you are willing to recognize, even when you were the one who caused them. Can a leader apologize without a single word? In Burkina Faso, that answer now lives not in press releases, but in something rarer: trust. Share this story with someone who still thinks power is about command. Let them witness what happens when leadership chooses to kneel beside the people before standing up for them. Because though the wheels have stopped spinning, something far greater was just beginning to turn. It started not with a speech, but with a spreadsheet. 12,000 rows, 12,000 names, 12,000 quiet moments of punishment, normalized, automated, erased from memory by the very system that inflicted them. but not forgotten by Ibrahim Traore. Each name on that sheet held more than data. It held a story interrupted, a mother rushing for medicine, a worker late to his shift, a father pulling over to pray. Each one was told without a word that their need was irrelevant, that the rule mattered more than the reason. Traoré understood something deeper. Apologies are not enough. When dignity is taken, it must be returned. And so he called for a reversal, not a press release, not a show, a logistical earthquake. Over 1.2 billion francs CFA, nearly $2 million, were traced, identified, and prepared to be refunded. Not through red tape, not buried in procedure, but with transparency, with purpose. Through what he named le registre de réparation, the registry of repair. No silence, no shame, only a clear public record of what had been taken and what would be given back. At first, no one believed it. How could they? A mother named Aissata arrived at her district office clutching a faded receipt torn at the corners from months in her handbag. She did not come for money. She came for something far rarer, to see if her government would finally see her. When the official handed her an envelope and said softly, "This is yours and we are sorry," she froze. Her fingers gripped the paper gently like it might dissolve. Then she whispered, as if speaking to herself, "So, we are not invisible anymore." And then she wept. Not because she gained, but because for once the state had admitted it was wrong. Elsewhere, in a quiet community center, a retired teacher named Boubacar sat waiting in a plastic chair. When his name was called, he rose with the quiet strength that had stayed with him even when his car was taken without cause 6 months before. He signed his name in the registry and said only this: "I did not need money. I needed acknowledgement. And now I have both." Word spread. But this was not aid. This was accountability. Traoré was not handing out favors. He was returning agency. He was returning truth. And then came a second invitation, subtle yet revolutionary. Each person who received a refund was asked to sign not just a receipt, but a second-page declaration that they had been heard, that their story mattered, that they were not a mistake to be erased, but a citizen to be remembered. Those pages were bound into a volume titled Names of the Repaired and placed not in a locked vault, but in the National Archives, not as political theater, but as evidence that a country once chose to return more than cash. It returned care. And then something even more unexpected unfolded. People began arriving not to receive, but to give back. A mechanic offered free oil changes to any single mother with a refund slip. A baker dropped off bags of bread at City Hall with a handwritten note, "Because you fed our hope." A group of school children donated crayons to the refund centers so they can write people's names in color. One said, "This was not charity. This was restoration." And it all began with one defiant question: can a receipt become a symbol of healing? In Burkina Faso, it already has. Today, the registry hangs in the center of the city, not behind glass, but open within reach. Children walk past and ask, "Who are these names?" And their parents reply, "These are the ones we hurt and chose to make whole again." What the government did was not flawless, but it was human. And sometimes that is where justice begins. If this story stirs something in your chest, do not let it rest there. Share it. Share it with someone who was ever fined for being poor, with someone who was punished for surviving a system designed to forget them. Let them know repair is not an illusion. It is a choice. And it begins when someone in power looks you in the eye and says, "We see you." Because in Burkina Faso, they were not just refunded, they were remembered. And from memory, something larger than money began to rise. A new city built not on silence, but on shared truth. Tearing up a fine does not erase the wound. You must return to the place where harm was done and rebuild it with your own hands. That is what Ibrahim Traore understood. So he did not stop at refunds. He went far beyond what even his closest ministers expected. He issued a bold command: 120 new parking lots. Free, permanent, dignified, 12 months. No delays. No exceptions. But this was never just about asphalt and yellow paint. It was about memory, because many of these lots would rise on the very streets where the most painful moments had unfolded, where a mother once knelt in tears beside her towed car, where an elder waited silently, ticket in hand, heart bruised. These were sites of trauma, and now they would be transformed, not erased, but redeemed. Traoré demanded that the process not be outsourced to distant developers. Instead, he called on the neighborhoods themselves. Communities became the architects of their own repair. Youth groups submitted sketches, elders debated names, artists came with brushes and dreams. Every community was asked the same sacred question. If justice could stand on this ground, what would it look like? One lot was named after Thomas Sankara, another after Wangari Maathai, and in a modest neighborhood where a midwife had once lost her car while delivering a child, the new lot was named Mama's Haven. Not everyone welcomed this renaissance. A group of private investors proposed managing the lots, introducing smart meters, hourly fees, and digital surveillance. They promised efficiency, revenue, modernization. But President Traoré refused. These are not investments, he said. They are apologies, and you do not sell your apology. The room went quiet, and for the first time in decades, a public space was not defended by regulation, but by remembrance. There were no guards with whistles, no apps, no cameras. Just open space marked not by prohibition, but by recognition. Children kicked footballs across painted lines. Vendors returned to sell roasted maize and mangoes at the edges. In the mornings, elders gathered under trees planted beside the lot to discuss politics, memories, and sometimes forgiveness. The spaces became more than functional. They became social sanctuaries, living proof that cities could hold both order and soul. In one district, a Friday reading circle formed on the lot. They called it Parliament of the Pavement, and in every gathering, one quiet question echoed, "Can a patch of asphalt become a form of justice?" In Burkina Faso, the answer was paved into being one lot at a time. Drivers stopped looking over their shoulders. Street vendors no longer scattered when uniforms approached. Even the officers began to change. One policeman said, "Now we protect space, not punish presence." In the northern district, a woman named Hajara, once fined mistakenly and bankrupted, now leads a volunteer team that sweeps the lot every evening. She said, "This is not just a parking spot. This is where my anger turned into something useful." What started as a government order became a communal offering. Under signs that now read, "Parking libre, espoir reconstruit." Free parking, rebuilt hope. People did not just find space, they found permission to belong. These were not just parking lots. They were pauses in the chaos. Proof that a nation, when brave enough to admit its wrongs, can repave its own conscience. And then came the 12th month. The final lot opened in the heart of Ouagadougou. It was the largest of them all. A stage was built not for a ribbon cutting, but for something rarer: testimony. One by one, residents came forward not to cheer the government, but to share what had changed within them. An elder man stood and said, "I park here every Sunday, not because I need to, but because this is where I remembered my country can still care." So ask yourself, can a parking lot be a form of justice? Can land once soaked in frustration be replanted with dignity? In a world that often forgets its poor, maybe the most radical kind of justice is this: a piece of land given, not sold, remembered, not erased. If this story moves something and you pass it on, send it to someone who still doubts that African cities can be models of moral design. Let them see what it looks like when power builds, not just enforces. Because in Burkina Faso, what we park on is not just pavement. It is a promise made solid underfoot. When the pavement is healed, justice must learn to follow in its footsteps. 12 months after the first refund was handed back, and 120 parking lots had bloomed like islands of dignity across Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traore stood not in front of ministers or military brass, but before the real architects of the street fruit sellers: teachers, mothers, motorcycle drivers, students, elders with calloused hands and quiet wisdom. And he asked them not what they feared, but what they deserved. If the law could speak to you, he asked, what should its voice sound like? For too long, the street had only heard orders shouted from above: fines, chains, warnings, removal. But what if for once the street could speak back? What if justice was shaped not just by codes, but by community? From that single question, something extraordinary was born. The new street code of Burkina Faso, not born in parliament, born in the public square. The first rule was clear yet radical: no punishment without provision. No one would be fined for violating a rule unless the government had first made it possible to follow. If there was no parking space, no fine. If there was no sign, no ticket. Traoré declared the burden of order must fall on those in power, not on those trying to survive it. The second rule, equally profound: the vulnerable must come first. Every zone in the city would provide visible, protected, free spaces for elders, the disabled, pregnant women, and low-income workers. Not as charity, as recognition that these were the people who held the city up. The third rule reshaped the very heart of justice. Community tribunals would be established in every district, not courtrooms, councils, comprised of neighbors, people who knew the rhythm of their own streets, who could tell the difference between an infraction and an act of necessity. In one district, a woman who had sold oranges at the same corner for over 2 decades was chosen to chair the tribunal. She said, "Now when someone is fined unfairly, they don't go to strangers. They come to us." This was not mere reform. It was a cultural reversal. The city no longer existed to control its citizens. It existed to respect them. Fear used to govern every movement: where to stop, how long to stay, who might be watching. Now something else was present: belonging, ownership, memory. Graffiti once sprayed in anger slowly faded, not scrubbed off but replaced by community murals. Messages like, "We park here because we belong here. This space is ours, not theirs." Police officers once trained to enforce began showing up to listen. Weekly community briefings were held. Officers sat with teachers, vendors, youth leaders, asking what was working, what needed changing. One officer said, "It used to be us versus them. Now we walk the same streets with the same mission." And still Traoré never claimed credit. He simply said, "I signed what the people wrote." So ask yourself, can a traffic law be written in the voice of the people in Burkina Faso? It already has. But the deeper question isn't about what the law says. It's about how it moves, how it waits, how it bends when needed, how it learns to trust those it governs. You know a law is alive not when it is feared, but when a mother no longer begs to park near a clinic, when a man in a wheelchair finds a space once denied, when a vendor knows her cart won't be seized because it shifted 6 inches too far. That is when the law is no longer a weapon. It is a welcome. If this story challenges what you thought law could be, send it to someone who still believes laws are made of stone. Let them see that even in Africa, laws can be written with care, courage, and correction, not as decrees, but as dialogue. Because what transformed in Burkina Faso was not just code or procedure, it was relationship. And from that relationship, a deeper awakening was beginning to ripple outward. Not just in Ouagadougou, but across a continent, asking itself a quiet, powerful question: if the street belongs to us, what else might we reclaim? It was never about the asphalt. Not really. It was about something quieter, something deeper, something buried beneath decades of forms, laws, and silent looks. It was about how a city decides who belongs and who simply learns to disappear. In Burkina Faso, beneath the hot noon sky, an elderly man stood before a sign that read, "Free Parking Zone." He wore a simple beige tunic. His hands trembled as he knelt to place a small bouquet at the foot of the sign, red, yellow, and white flowers, wrapped in old newspaper gathered from his own garden. A young journalist nearby asked him why. The man paused, then whispered, "Because for the first time, I feel like there's a place in this city that is mine, even though I own nothing." And that quiet declaration is what this story was always about. Yes, 12,000 unjust fines were returned. Yes, 120 lots were built. Yes, a new street code was shaped by the hands and voices of street vendors, midwives, mechanics, and students. But none of that matters if it doesn't lead to the most radical sentence in any language. "You matter here." Ibrahim Traore did not call a press conference. He did not wave flags or declare victory. He simply walked, listened, paused beside elders, collected sketches from children, sat on the edge of broken benches, and listened to the rhythm of people breathing. Breathing not in fear, but in relief. Because real justice does not demand applause. It does not parade. It listens. It waits. It shows up when no one is watching and asks, is the world we've built big enough for the people who live inside it? This is not idealism. This is not theory. This is what happens when a nation stops copying models that never saw it, when it stops punishing before providing, when it dares to ask, what if governance was not power but protection? And in the humble silence of parking lots and torn-up tickets, Burkina Faso gave the world an answer. It offered a new definition of justice, one rooted in humility, one that understands survival is not a crime, one that redefines leadership as care in action. This is the kind of Burkina Faso latest news that may never reach the front page. It will not trend at Davos, but it moves in the breath of market women who no longer scatter when uniforms appear. It hums in the footsteps of school children walking to class without glancing over their shoulders. It sings softly in the soul of a people who, after lifetimes of silence, now hear something startlingly human. You are seen. You are heard. You have space. And what makes this story powerful is not that it happened. It's that it can happen again. Ibrahim Traore did not offer a miracle. He offered something more lasting. He offered the hardest word in leadership repair. Because justice does not mean being perfect. It means being present, stopping when it is easier to ignore, listening when pride wants to talk, rebuilding when walking away is cheaper. Rise, Africa. Rise exists for moments like this. Not to chase spectacle, but to amplify substance. Not to promise change, but to document it. Because this continent is not waiting to be saved. It is rising one intersection, one law, one act of dignity at a time. So we do not close this story. We open it with a question: can freedom begin the moment we stop punishing survival? We believe it can. Because we have seen it in an old man's trembling hands. In a woman's steady steps toward a space no one can take from her. In the sacred distance between what once was fear and what is now peace. This is the new rhythm of justice in Africa. If something in you stirred reading this, do not let it vanish in the scroll of a screen. Share it. Speak it. Send it to someone who still thinks Africa is only a dream, not a design. Tell them we are already building. And no, Ibrahim Traore did not build a monument. He built something harder. He built mercy. He built ground. He built room for a nation to exhale. And this is your story too. Because if the streets belong to the people, then so does the future. And this time we are not stepping aside. We are making space and standing in it.